The warning didn't come as a message, a threat, or even a whisper. It came as a quiet signal buried deep inside the cosmic noise, so faint that most civilizations would have ignored it. But humanity didn't. Earth had grown into a sprawling galactic empire by then, its people scattered across hundreds of worlds, its fleets stretching from one star cluster to the next. Yet despite all that power, despite all that expansion, a strange uneasiness had settled across the empire. Something was watching them, something old, something patient. The story begins on a cold frontier outpost orbiting a dying red star. The station crew had been monitoring radiation spikes for weeks, but nothing prepared them for what appeared next: a symbol. Not written in any known language, not sent in any familiar pattern, but clearly intentional. It pulsed slowly, like a heartbeat, as if the universe itself was trying to warn them. When the analysts ran simulations, the result chilled even the most confident minds. It was a warning from another alien civilization, a species long thought to be extinct, one that legends said vanished after confronting a threat beyond understanding. The Galactic Empire tried to dismiss it at first. Humans had always been bold, curious, and maybe a little reckless. Many leaders insisted it was just another mystery in a galaxy full of strange echoes. But the warning kept repeating, and each time it grew sharper, as though whoever sent it realized humanity was struggling to understand. Soon, 3 simple ideas became clear. Do not enter the region beyond the dark nebula. Do not follow the signals that lure you inside. And whatever you do, do not trust the silence. But by the time the Empire started to worry, it was already too late. Ships had vanished. Explorers who pushed beyond the nebula were never heard from again. And the last transmission from a lost scout vessel described something impossible, a structure the size of a star system, hidden behind shifting clouds of cosmic dust. It didn't look like a fortress or a machine. Instead, it looked alive. Back on Earth, tension rippled through every level of government. Military councils pushed for immediate action. Scientists demanded more data. Citizens across multiple worlds felt a quiet fear growing, even though they couldn't explain why. The Empire had seen war, had faced alien rivals, had survived cosmic disasters, but this felt different. This was not an enemy they could negotiate with or intimidate. This was something that had been waiting for a very long time. Among the people trying to make sense of it was a young xenology researcher who had spent years studying forgotten species and abandoned ruins. They believed the warning came from a civilization known only through whispers in ancient archives, beings who once shaped the evolution of countless worlds before vanishing abruptly. According to their theories, these beings didn't die, they hid. And they hid because something far darker had awakened in the galaxy. The Empire's high command, however, couldn't afford hesitation. Curiosity had built Earth's power. Hesitation had never been part of its nature. So they sent a fleet fast, armed, and ready to break through the nebula's shadow. But the closer the ships got, the more strange things became. Sensors flickered. Gravity bent in unnatural ways. Lights dimmed as though something was feeding on the energy around them. And then, at the very edge of the nebula, the stars simply disappeared. No one understood what they were seeing. It was like the galaxy had folded in on itself, like the night sky had been erased. Yet inside that darkness, faint outlines began to appear, vast shapes forming across the void, stretching and curling like the bones of a planet-sized creature. The fleet tried to retreat, but space itself shifted. Paths that once led outward now bent inward. The trap was already closing. Far away on Earth, alarms echoed across command rooms. The Empire realized the terrible meaning behind the alien warning. The danger wasn't inside the nebula was the bait. Something had been waiting for someone bold enough, curious enough, or arrogant enough to step inside. And now humanity had stepped. Communication with the fleet dropped one by one, replaced by static that sounded almost like breathing. Scientists and strategists scrambled for answers, searching for any way to break through whatever force had wrapped itself around their ships. But every reading pointed to the same truth: the Empire wasn't facing an enemy, they were inside one. As the final surviving ship sent a desperate coded message before its signal was swallowed, One last line cracked through the static, a line that sent a cold shiver through every listening soul. We weren't exploring. We were being invited. And as Earth tried to understand what that meant, a new signal began pulsing across the galaxy, slow, steady, and getting closer. The pulsing signal kept echoing through every channel, every relay, every listening post across the galactic empire. No one knew what it meant, but everyone felt the same thing, a slow tightening around humanity's place in the galaxy. As the signal grew stronger, so did the fear that whatever was coming had already begun its move. Yet life across the empire didn't stop. People still traded goods between distant colonies. Families still sent messages to loved ones light years away, and the government still held its meetings. But beneath the routine, a quiet pressure built, like the calm before a storm that hadn't revealed its shape yet. The xenology researcher, who had been among the first to decode the earlier warning, now found themselves drawn deeper into the crisis. They spent long nights in an old archive facility orbiting Earth, surrounded by holographic records and dusty star charts from civilizations long gone. The archive smelled faintly of metal and ozone, a reminder of how many secrets had passed through its halls. Every ancient tablet, every fragment of alien script, pointed to the same troubling idea. Someone had studied humanity long before humanity ever reached the stars. Not as an enemy, not as an ally, but as a variable in a much larger design. Across the empire, other people were beginning to sense the change as well. Explorers stationed on remote frontier worlds noticed strange fluctuations in the sky stars, flickering not because of natural interference, but as if something enormous was passing in front of them. Traders reported hearing faint mechanical sounds in deep space, even when their instruments reported no ships nearby. And in quiet moments, some claimed they felt watched, even inside the safety of their own vessels. Meanwhile, Earth's leadership struggled to keep control. They were used to dealing with political pressure, border disputes, even the occasional alien rivalry. But this situation was different. There was no face to negotiate with, no voice to challenge, no territory to defend. The threat felt like an idea more than an opponent, a presence that had been here long before the empire existed. Every expert who studied the signals came to the same unsettling conclusion. This wasn't an attack. It was a countdown. The researchers' work soon attracted attention. A small group of specialists, scientists, historians, and a few cautiously minded military officers started gathering in the archives with them. They talked about old myths told by early settlers on distant worlds, myths describing luminous beings who shaped the development of younger species. Most dismissed those stories as creative exaggerations, but now they began to wonder if there had been some truth in them. If an ancient civilization really had guided others, then perhaps these warnings were one of their last attempts to prevent another disaster. One evening, while analyzing a fragment from a long-lost culture, the researcher found something that made their breath catch. It wasn't a message, not a drawing, not even a symbol. It was a map. A star map showing the exact same nebula where the Empire's fleet had vanished. But the map showed it not as a cloud or a region of unstable gravity, it showed it as a boundary. A border meant to keep something inside. The map's edges were marked by small curved lines that almost resembled claws closing inward. Even more unsettling, the map wasn't drawn as if someone was looking at the nebula from afar. It was drawn from the perspective of something inside it, as though the artist had lived within those shifting shadows and understood the structure from within. The researchers shared this discovery with the group, and the room fell silent. They all knew what it meant. The nebula wasn't the trap itself. It was a containment shell. Something inside had once been sealed away. And now that something was waking up. As tension grew on Earth, the Empire's outer colonies began to experience strange disruptions. Communication arrays flickered out, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. Cargo ships traveled through familiar routes only to emerge several days late, with their crews reporting that star patterns had shifted in ways that defied every known astronomical model. People whispered about shadows moving in vacuum, shapes that vanished when looked at directly. Back in the archive facility, the researcher noticed another disturbing pattern. The pulsing signal that had begun spreading across the galaxy was changing, becoming clearer. It now carried harmonic echoes that resembled structured speech, though no system could translate it. Yet the tone felt less like a warning than a call, something seeking to draw attention toward the nebula. Something inviting? No one knew whether responding was dangerous or necessary, but Earth could not ignore it. A second fleet was being prepared, smaller but far more advanced. Its purpose wasn't exploration or confrontation, it was investigation. To understand what had taken the earlier fleet, to uncover what force had been sealed in the nebula, and to determine whether the signal was a distress call, a beacon, or a lure. As preparations continued, the researchers stood near a large observation window overlooking Earth. The signal pulsed again, vibrating faintly through the glass like a heartbeat echoing across the stars. They realized the truth wasn't whether humanity was ready. It was whether humanity had already been chosen. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the nebula, something stirred, slow, vast, and aware. The signal continued to pulse through the Empire, but now it carried a weight that no one could ignore. It didn't matter whether someone lived on a crowded city world near Earth or on a lonely mining station at the edge of the frontier. Everyone felt the same quiet pressure closing in. Even people who didn't follow the news sensed something changing in the background of life, like a shift in gravity that wasn't strong enough to throw them off balance, but strong enough to make them uneasy. The Galactic Empire had faced threats before, but this time the danger felt woven into the fabric of space itself. The researcher, who had become deeply involved in uncovering the meaning behind the ancient warnings, found themselves juggling fear and responsibility. They had been invited to join the high-level task group preparing the new fleet's mission. It wasn't a military group in the traditional sense. Instead, it brought together scientists, analysts, navigators, and a few calm, observant officers who understood that raw firepower might not mean anything where they were going. Every meeting added new layers to the mystery instead of peeling them away. One of the officers had been stationed near the nebula years ago, back when it was just another unexplored region. They remembered seeing strange distortions, then two tiny flickers, faint echoes, but nothing like the massive signal the Empire faced now. They spoke quietly, almost respectfully, as if describing something that deserved caution rather than fear. They believed the Empire had mistaken the quiet for emptiness, that the nebula had always been occupied, just asleep. Another specialist, an astrophysicist from a distant colony world, had a different theory. They thought the nebula wasn't hiding something physical, but something dimensional, patterns of space folding in ways that didn't follow standard physics. According to them, the missing fleet might not be destroyed, but shifted somewhere else, trapped in a pocket that existed beside normal space. Their explanation didn't comfort anyone. If the nebula could distort reality itself, then the threat was far beyond anything humanity had prepared for. While these debates continued, subplots unfolded across the Empire. Colonists on distant worlds began to organize small watch groups, sharing sightings of unusual star movements. Traders formed tighter convoys, reluctant to travel alone in the deep routes between systems. Even the Empire's communication networks experienced subtle glitches, messages arriving out of order, timestamps briefly scrambling, signals carrying faint overlapping layers that no one had recorded. It was as though something large was brushing against the Empire's borders, testing the structure of its systems. The researcher's personal life was affected too. Friends from the Academy sent messages asking if the rumors were true. Some were afraid. Others were excited, imagining this might lead to historic discoveries. One message stood out, a simple line delivered late at night. If the warning comes from an ancient species, why are we the ones hearing it now? That question stayed with them. Why humanity? Why now? What changed? Meanwhile, in the command center back on Earth, leaders were struggling with a different challenge. The more they examined the incoming signal, the more they realized its rhythm matched readings found in forgotten survey logs from centuries earlier. That meant the signal wasn't new. It had been echoing for ages. Only now had it grown strong enough for humans to detect clearly. The idea unsettled everyone. Something had been calling long before the Galactic Empire even existed. The new fleet, smaller, faster, more prepared, was almost ready to depart. Engineers worked through endless nights strengthening the ship's hulls and shielding, not because they expected battle, but because no one knew what kind of pressure or distortion they might encounter. Navigation teams trained with simulated nebula patterns, trying to map shifting paths that changed every hour. The fleet wasn't going in to conquer. They were going in to survive. As launch day approached, tension spread across the Empire like a quiet electric current. News networks filled with speculation. Families argued at dinner tables. Children asked why the stars looked strange. Even pets across several worlds were reported to react oddly, staring at the sky as if listening to something humans couldn't hear. The signal was no longer just a cosmic anomaly, it had become part of everyday life. Inside the archive facility, the researchers stayed focused on the star map found earlier. They traced the curved lines again and again, trying to understand the intention behind the design. The shape wasn't random. It resembled something like a mouth closing or a cage meant to contain something powerful. But there was another detail the researcher noticed only after hours of studying it. In the center of the nebula, a tiny symbol glowed faintly, almost invisible to the eye. They enhanced it carefully and stared in confusion. The symbol wasn't alien, it was human. A shape found on early probes launched centuries before the Empire rose. Probes that had vanished without explanation. If those probes had reached the nebula long ago, then humanity had been marked long before it ever knew the nebula existed. The realization struck the researcher with a quiet, heavy force. The Empire didn't stumble into the trap. It had been guided there, slowly, patiently, for generations. Outside, the signal pulsed again louder than before, as if answering the thought directly. And somewhere deep within the nebula's shifting darkness, something responded with a pulse of its own. The signal didn't just grow stronger, it grew sharper, more focused, as if it finally knew exactly where humanity was standing. Every listening post reported the same thing. The pulse now carried layers, almost like overlapping voices buried under static. The more experts tried to decode it, the more they felt like the signal wasn't trying to speak to them, but around them communicating with something else entirely. Something not yet visible. The new fleet prepared for launch under a sky that felt too quiet. Even Earth's natural hum, the traffic, the winds, the constant movement of billions seemed muted. People watched the fleet's departure from balconies, windows, and crowded city squares. They didn't cheer. No one dared to. Instead, they watched with a stillness that came from understanding that whatever waited in the nebula was unlike anything humanity had encountered before. The researchers stood among the mission specialists aboard the command ship, feeling the weight of every unanswered question press against their thoughts. The ship vibrated softly as engines powered up, and the final countdown echoed through the corridors. When the fleet finally jumped into deep space, the familiar stars stretched into long streaks of white, and for a moment everything felt normal. But as soon as they crossed into the outer boundary of the nebula, that illusion shattered. The stars behind them flickered, bending as though seen through water. Light lost its shape. Colors shifted in ways the human eye wasn't meant to see. The pilots reported that their instruments couldn't settle on stable readings, distances stretched and twisted. Space itself was folding like fabric pulled from several directions at once. The researcher felt a strange pressure against their chest, not painful, but heavy enough to make breathing harder. They glanced around and noticed others reacting the same way. It was as if the nebula had a presence, a silent awareness brushing against them. The signal outside continued its slow, rhythmic pulse echoing through the ship's metal bones. Hours into the journey, the fleet encountered the first distortion. A thin, rippling wave passed across space, bending the view of the nebula ahead. Sensors scrambled, alarms chimed, and heat signatures flickered through the dark like distant shapes surfacing beneath deep water. The ships adjusted course, but the wave seemed to follow. Not chasing, observing? The officers remained steady, issuing calm commands, but the unease was growing. The astrophysicist specialist whispered that they weren't traveling forward, they were being redirected. Guided. Every path they calculated bent subtly inward, pulling them toward the nebula's center. Meanwhile, back on Earth, observers recorded a terrifying discovery. The signal wasn't just stronger in the nebula, it was spreading. Entire regions of space near the Empire's borders showed faint echoes of the same pulse, like ripples expanding outward. Something was moving beneath the surface of reality, pushing its influence across star systems that had never shown abnormalities before. Families began to evacuate small settlements near the frontier. Civilian traffic was restricted. Even the most skeptical leaders admitted that the Empire might be facing something far larger than a simple unknown phenomenon. Some believed it was a creature, others believed it was a machine, and a few believed it was something in between. Inside the nebula, the fleet slowed as the darkness thickened. It was no longer a cloud of dust or gas, it felt like entering the shadow of something immense. Sensors picked up faint geometric patterns drifting around them, shapes so large they could only be seen when flashes of light revealed their edges. The patterns resembled fossilized structures, but each one moved with eerie smoothness, like old memories floating in liquid. The researcher stared at them through the observation deck, feeling the air grow cooler. The shapes weren't random. They were aligned, arranged in spirals and rings. It looked like a map or a warning. Then the first communication attempt from the missing fleet came through. It wasn't a message. It wasn't even sound. It was a single burst of static, followed by a long, trembling hum. The hum carried the same pattern as the ancient star map. It matched perfectly. Everyone on the command ship froze. If the missing fleet had tried to warn them, then whatever had taken them had allowed that signal to escape, on purpose. Suddenly, the fleet's forward sensors lit up. A massive silhouette appeared in the fog. It wasn't a ship, it wasn't a creature. It was something far bigger, an entire region of space shaped into a hollow structure. The walls were made of shifting scales of dark matter, opening and closing slowly like a giant breathing. Every breath bent starlight. Every breath pulled the fleet closer. The command ship's engines roared as the pilots tried to stabilize the trajectory, but the pull only grew stronger. The officers shouted coordinates. Alarms echoed through every deck. The nebula around them contracted like a closing hand. The researcher felt cold dread rising as they realized the truth behind the ancient warning. The nebula wasn't hiding something dangerous. The nebula was the danger. And as the fleet tumbled toward the enormous structure, the pulsing signal stopped. For the first time since the crisis began, the galaxy fell completely silent. But the silence didn't comfort anyone. It felt like the moment before something enormous opened its eyes. The silence pressed against the fleet like a physical force, thick and heavy, as if the nebula itself were holding its breath. Every pilot, every scientist, every crew member froze at their stations, waiting for anything to break the tension. The massive dark structure ahead seemed to pulse faintly, its shifting surface reflecting fragments of starlight like eyes watching from the depths. The fleet drifted closer, unable to pull away, caught in a gravity-like pull that defied all known physics. Inside the command ship, the researcher felt a strange calm settle over them. Fear had been replaced by an almost painful clarity. Everything they had studied, the ancient maps, the symbols, the myths pointed to this moment. The nebula wasn't a prison, it was a warning ring. A boundary placed around something that should never have been disturbed. And humanity, with all its ambition and curiosity, had stepped right across it. The structure opened, not with noise, not with violence, but with a slow, inevitable unfolding. Layers of dark matter peeled back like petals of a cosmic flower, revealing a glowing core at the center. It pulsed with a rhythm that matched the old signal answering it. The Empire had never been the target. They had been the trigger. Whatever lay inside had been waiting for a race bold enough to approach, curious enough to investigate, and advanced enough to open the seal. Energy ripples spread across the fleet, scattering readings and cracking through comms. Some ships spun wildly before stabilizing, others dimmed as though their power was being drained. The researcher watched in awe as the glowing core expanded, revealing swirling patterns within patterns that resembled neural pathways, as if the heart of a giant mind had been revealed. Then the signal returned. Not as a pulse, but as a voice. It didn't speak in words. It spoke in impressions, sensations, images. It spoke in the way deep oceans might speak if they could form thoughts. The crew felt the meaning rather than heard it. The ancient race that once mapped the nebula had created the boundary to protect the galaxy from this sleeping intelligence, an entity that existed between physical and dimensional space. The boundary had weakened over time. And the moment humanity entered the nebula, it sensed the breach. It reached for them. The fleet shook violently. Lights flickered, panels sparked, gravity shifted in waves. The officers shouted commands, desperately trying to stabilize the ship. Alarms screamed across the deck. The glowing core expanded faster, its energy curling outward like tendrils searching for something warm and alive. Then the unexpected happened. The second signal, the old warning signal, burst through the noise again, stronger than ever. It collided with the core's energy, creating a shockwave that rippled through the entire nebula. The researchers stumbled, grabbing a console as the ship lurched sideways. The officers stared at the readings in disbelief. The warning signal wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the nebula, from the core itself. The nebula wasn't containing a hostile intelligence, it was containing two. One was the awakening force pulling the fleet inward. The other was the last remnant of the ancient civilization that had vanished ages ago, preserved in the heart of the nebula like a memory trying to hold the line. The ancient remnant spoke again, its presence clearer this time. It wasn't trying to warn humanity away. It was asking for help. The fleet wasn't trapped. It had been brought here because humanity was the first civilization, advanced enough to intervene. The nebula's seal had weakened to the point where the hostile entity could finally break out. The ancient remnant couldn't hold it back alone. It needed a push, a surge of energy strong enough to collapse the dimensional fold and seal the entity away for good. And humanity had brought that energy with its ships. The officers made the decision quickly, not out of bravery but necessity. The fleet diverted all power into a coordinated burst aimed at the nebula's core. Engines burned white. Shields glowed. The space around them trembled like a storm on the edge of breaking. The researcher felt the air vibrate as the burst hit the core. The nebula responded with a blinding flash. The hostile presence shredded apart, its energy scattered through collapsing folds of space. The dark structures dissolved, the pull on the fleet released instantly. The ancient remnant dimmed like a fading ember, its final whisper echoing across the comes a soft, grateful pulse of light. The fleet drifted free. Breaths filled the command ship. People cried, laughed, or simply stood trembling. Humanity had survived. The nebula calmed, shrinking into a harmless cloud of dust and light. The danger was over, or so they thought. As the fleet prepared to return home, the researcher noticed one final reading on their console. A faint signature. A new signal forming from the remnants of the core. It pulsed not with warning, not with fear, but with recognition. It was studying them, learning from them. And it was spreading not through space this time, but through energy. Human energy. The nebula was gone. But something had followed them out. The fleet drifted in the calm that followed the collapse of the nebula, but the researcher couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in a way no one had planned for. The ships were quiet now, running on backup systems while engineers checked for structural damage. Crew members moved through the corridors with slow, careful steps, still carrying the weight of what they had seen. The nebula was gone, the ancient danger was sealed again, and the hostile entity had been scattered. By all measures, the mission had succeeded. Yet the faint signature pulsing through the consoles stayed in the researcher's mind like a lingering echo. When the fleet made its jump back toward Earth, the stars unfolded around them in familiar shapes. There were no distortions, no shifting lights, no strange shadows slipping between dimensions. Everything looked normal again. But inside the sensor logs, a thin trace followed the ships, a pattern that didn't belong to any known energy form. It moved subtly, almost like a heartbeat from something learning how to breathe in a new environment. The researcher didn't report it at first. They needed to understand it before alarming the others, especially after everything the crew had endured. Upon returning to Earth, the fleet received a quiet but heartfelt welcome. There were no grand celebrations, no loud announcements, just a collective exhale from billions who had lived with weeks of tension. People watched the ships descend through the atmosphere, streaking across the sky like returning guardians, families reunited. Leaders delivered calm statements about the successful mission, and across the empire the strange, flickering stars and distorted readings that had haunted the frontier gradually disappeared. Life began to slide back into its familiar routines. The researcher met with the high-level council to share the full story. They described the ancient civilization's role, the sealed intelligence, and the nebula's collapse. The council listened with a level of focus rarely seen, recognizing that humanity had stepped into a conflict older than its oldest myths. They asked careful questions, wanting to understand whether the threat might return. The researcher told them the truth as they understood it. The entity was scattered, weakened far beyond its ability to reform. The ancient remnant had faded peacefully. The boundary had been restored. But they kept one detail quiet for the moment: the faint new signature. After the meeting, they returned to the archive facility where everything had first begun. The star maps, the holograms, the old symbols, all felt different now, as if they had been waiting for this chapter to be completed. The researcher placed the updated nebula map onto the main display. It now showed only a cloud of dust and drifting particles, nothing dangerous. Nothing alive? No borders drawn like a warning. It felt strangely empty, like the universe had erased a scar that no longer needed to be remembered. Days passed, the empire returned to stability. Traders resumed their routes, explorers launched new missions, and citizens gradually let go of the fear that had shadowed their lives. The signal that once rippled through every listening post was gone. Yet the researcher kept studying the faint signature in the fleet logs. It wasn't growing stronger. It wasn't spreading across systems. It simply existed, quiet, observant, almost curious. One evening, while analyzing the latest scans, the researcher finally understood what the signature represented. It wasn't a fragment of the hostile entity. It wasn't a leftover threat. It was a memory. A small piece of the ancient remnant that had helped them, an imprint shaped from the last burst of energy when the nebula collapsed. It had bonded with the fleet's power signatures as a final message. Not a warning, but a gift? When they enhanced the waveform, the pattern formed a familiar shape, the symbol found at the center of the ancient star map. Only this time, the symbol wasn't a closing boundary. It was opening outward like a door or a path. A sign that humanity, by surviving the nebula's trial, had been recognized as ready for something greater. Not danger. Not conflict, understanding. The researchers shared this discovery with the council. Instead of fear, they felt a sense of quiet pride. Humanity had not been chosen as prey. They had been chosen as witnesses to something vast and ancient. The empire wasn't being watched by a threat anymore. It was being acknowledged by a civilization that had survived millennia longer than any known species. As the story closed, the researcher stood on a balcony overlooking Earth at night. The stars above looked steady again, untouched by distortion. People walked below, laughing, working, living. The galaxy felt wide and open once more. But now, humanity understood that hidden within the quiet corners of space were forces older than empires, older than maps, older than memory itself. And instead of feeling small, the researcher felt something else: responsibility. Humanity had been tested and had endured. The ancient warning had turned into a new beginning. The nebula was gone, but its lesson remained. The galaxy was far more connected and far more alive than anyone had ever imagined. With the sky clear and peaceful again, the researcher allowed themselves a small smile. The story that began with a warning now ended with a promise. Humanity's journey into the unknown had only just begun.